Chapter 1. My father's family name being Pirrip, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. I give Pirrip as my father's family name on the authority of his tombstone and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or mother, or never saw any likeness of either of them, for the days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me the odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. From the character in turn of the inscription, also Georgina, wife of the above, I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. To 5 little stone lozenges, each about 1.5 feet long, which were arranged in a neat row beside their grave, and were sacred to the memory of the 5 little brothers of mine, who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in that universal struggle, I am indebted for a belief I religiously entertained that they had all been born on their backs with their hands in their trouser pockets, and had never taken them out in this state of existence. Ours was the marsh country down by the river, within as the river wound 20 miles to the sea. My first most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a remarkable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgina, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the above, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dykes and mounds and gates, were scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it and beginning to cry was Pip. "Hold your noise!" cried a terrible voice as a man started up from the graves at the side of the church porch. Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse grey, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat and with broken shoes, with an old rag tied around his head, a man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stones and cut by flints and stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Please, pray don't do that, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick!" "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, staring at me. "Give it mouth." Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said he. "Point out the place." I pointed to where our village lay, on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he'd made it go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling, while he ate the bread ravenously. "You young dog," said he, licking his lips. "What fat cheeks you've got." I believe they were fat, though I was at that time undersized for my year and not strong. "Darn me if I couldn't eat 'em," said the man with a threatening shake of his head.
and I've half a mind to do it.
I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, and partly to keep from crying.
"Now, look'ee here," said the man. "Where's your mother?"
"There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgina. That's my mother."
"Oh,"
said he, coming back.
"And that's your father along your mother?"
"Yes, sir," said I. "Him too, late of this parish."
"Ha!"
he muttered, and then, considering,
"Who'd you live with, supposing you kindly elect to live, which I haven't made up my mind about?"
"My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery the blacksmith, sir."
"Blacksmith, eh?"
said he, and looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, tilted me back as far as he could hold on to me, so that his eyes looked down most powerfully into mine, and mine looked most helplessly into his.
"Now, look'ee here," he said. "The question being whether you're let to live depends on this. You know what a file is?"
Yes, sir."
"You know what whittles is?"
"Yes, sir." After each question he tilted me over a little more, so he gave me a greater sense of helplessness and danger.
"You get me a file."
He tilted me again.
"You get me whittles."
He tilted me again.
"You bring 'em both to me."
He tilted me again.
"Or I'll have your heart and liver out."
He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, "If you would kindly let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll, so that the church jumped over its own weathercock. Then he held me by the arms in an upright position on top of the stone, and went on in these fearful terms.
"You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at the old battery over yonder. You do it, and you never dare say a word or dare to make a sign concerning you have seen such a person as me or any other person whomsoever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go on from my words in any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and liver shall be tore out, roasted, and ate. Now, I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man in with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man hears the words I speak. That young man has a secret way peculiar to himself of getting at a boy and his heart and his liver. It's in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, he may be warm in bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe, but that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. I am keeping that young man from harming of you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold on to that young man, hold him off from your inside. Now, what do you say?"
I said that I would get him the file, and I would get him what broken bits of food I could, and I would come to him at the battery early in the morning.
"Say, Lord strike you dead if you don't,"
said the man. I said so, and he took me down.
"Now," he pursued, "you remember what you've undertook, and you remember that young man. You get home."
Good night, sir," I faltered.
"Much of that,"
said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat.
I wish I was a frog or an eel.
At the same time he hugged his shuddering body in both arms, clasping himself as if to hold himself together, and limped towards the low church wall. As I saw him go, picking his way among the nettles and among the brambles that wound around the green mounds, he looked in my eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people, stretching up cautiously out of their graves to get a twist upon his ankle and pull him down. When he came to the low church wall, he got over it like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then turned round and looked for me. And when I saw him turning, I set my face towards home and made the best use of my legs. But presently I looked over my shoulder and saw him going on again towards the river, still hugging himself in both arms, and picking his way with his sore feet among the great stones dropped into the marshes here and there, for stepping places when the rains were heavy or the tide was in. The marshes were just a long, black, horizontal line then, as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad nor yet so black, and the sky was just a low, long, angry line, dense and black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered, like an unhooped cask upon a pole, an ugly thing when you were near it. The other was a gibbet, with some chains hanging to it which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on towards this latter as if he were the pirate come back to life and come down and going to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they too thought so. I looked all around for the horrible young man and could see no sign of him. But now, as I was frightened again and ran home, I didn't stop for the world. Chapter 2. My sister, Mrs. Jo Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and her neighbours because she had brought me up by hand. Having at that time to find out for myself what this expression meant, and knowing her to have a very hard and heavy hand, and to be in much habit of laying it upon her husband as well as on me, I suppose that Jo Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Jo Gargery marry her by hand. Jo was a fair man, with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face, with eyes of such very unclouded blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed with their own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength, and also in weakness. My sister, Mrs. Jo, with black hair and eyes which such have a prevailing redness of skin, that I sometimes wondered whether it was possible that she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of with soap. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron fastened over her head behind with 2 loops, and having a square impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made it so powerful a merit in herself, and had a strong reproach against Jo that she wore this apron so much, though I really see no reason why she should have worn it at all, or why, if she did wear it, she should not have taken it off every day of her life. Jo's forge adjoined our house, which was a wooden house, as many of our dwellings in the country were, most of them at the time. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up, and Jo was sitting alone in the kitchen. Jo and I being fellow sufferers and having confidences as such, Jo imparted a confidence to me the moment I raised the latch of the door and peeped in upon him, seeing him opposite, sitting in the chimney corner.
Mrs. Jo's been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and she's out now, making it a baker's dozen.
Is she?
Yes, Pip, said Joe. And what's worse, she's got Tickler with her.
At this dismal intelligence I twisted the only button on my waistcoat round and round and looked in great depression at the fire. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame.
She sat down, said Joe, and she got up and she made a grab at Tickler and she rampaged out. That's what she did,
said Joe, clearly staring at the fire between the low bars and poking it with a poker and looking at it.
She rampaged out, Pip.
How long has she been gone, Joe? I always treated him with the larger species of child. He's no more than my equal.
Well,
said Joe, glancing up at the Dutch clock,
she's been a rampaging this last spell about 5 minutes. Pip, Pip, she's coming. Get behind the door, old chap, and have a jack towel twixt you.
I took his advice. My sister, Mrs. Joe, throwing the door wide open and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately divined the cause and applied Tickler to it without further investigation. She concluded by throwing me, I often served as a connubial missile, at Joe, who had, glad to get hold of me on any terms, passed me on into the chimney and quietly fenced me in with his great leg.
Where have you been, you young monkey? She said, stamping her foot. Tell me directly, or you'll be... You've been wearing me away with fret and worry and I'd have you out of that corner if you was 50 pits and he was 500 gargeries.
I've only been to the churchyard, said I from my stool, crying and rubbing myself.
Churchyard?
Repeated my sister.
If that weren't for me, you'd have been in the churchyard years ago and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand?
You did, said I.
And why did I do it, I should like to know?
Exclaimed my sister. I whimpered. I don't know.
I don't, said my sister. I never do it again, I know that. I may truly say I'd never have this apron off of me since you were born. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife, and him a gargery, without being your mother.
My thoughts strayed from that question as I looked discontentedly at the fire, for the fugitive out of the marshes with the iron leg, the mysterious young man, the fire, the food, and the dreadful pledge I was under to commit a larceny on those sheltering premises rose before me in avenging coals.
Ha!
said Mrs. Joe, restoring Tickler to his station.
Churchyard, indeed. You may well say churchyard, you two. One of us, by and by. You'll drive me to the churchyard betwixt you one of these days, and oh, the precious pair you'd be without me.
As she applied herself to set the tea things, Joe peeped down at me over his leg as if he were mentally casting me and calculating what kind of pair we practically should make under the grievous circumstances foreshadowed. After that he sat feeling his right leg and his flaxen curls and whiskers, and following Mrs. Joe about with his blue eyes, as his manner always was at squally times. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with her left hand, she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it and sometimes a needle, which we afterwards got into our mouths. And then she got some butter, not too much, on a knife, and spread it on the loaf in an apothecary way, as if she were making a plaster, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity and trimming the moulding of butter off the crust. Then she gave the knife a final smart swipe on the edge of the plaster, and then sawed a very thick round off the loaf, which she finally, before separating from the loaf, hewed into 2 halves, of which Joe got one and I got the other. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I durst not eat my own slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance and his ally, the still more dreadful young man. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my larcenous researches might find nothing available in the safe. Therefore, I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose I found to be quite awful. It was as if I had to make up my mind to leap from the top of a high house or plunge into a great depth of water, and it was made the more difficult by the unconscious Joe. In our already mentioned Freemasonry as fellow sufferers, and in his good-natured companionship with me, it was our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which stimulated us to new exertions. Tonight, Joe several times invited me by the display of his fast diminishing slice to enter upon our usual friendly competition. But he found me each time with my yellow mug of tea on my knee and mine untouched bread and butter on the other. At last I desperately considered that the thing contemplated must be done, and that it had best been done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked away from me and got my bread and butter down my leg. Joe was evidently made uncomfortable by what he supposed to be my loss of appetite, and took a thoughtful bite out of his slice, which he didn't seem to enjoy. He turned it much around in his mouth, much longer than usual, pondering over it a good deal, and after gulped it all down like a pill. He was about to take another bite, and he had just got his head on one side for a good purchase on it, when his eye fell on me, and he saw that my bread and butter was gone. The wonder and consternation with which Joe stooped on the threshold and stopped his bite and stared at me were too evident to escape my sister's observation.
"What's the matter now?"
she said smartly as she put down her cup. I say, you know," muttered Joe, shaking his head at me in very serious remonstrance. "Pip, old chap, you do yourself a mischief. It'll stick somewhere. You can't have chewed it, Pip."
"What's the matter?"
repeated my sister more sharply than before. If you can cough up any trifle, Pip, I'd recommend you do it," said Joe, all aghast. "Manners is manners, but still your health's your health." By this time my sister was quite desperate, and so she pounced on Joe, and taking him by two whiskers, knocked his head for a while against the wall behind him, while I sat in the corner, looking guiltily on.
"Now, perhaps you'll tell me what's the matter,"
said my sister, out of breath.
"You great staring stuck pig!"
Joe looked at her in a helpless way, then took a helpless bite, and looked at me again. You know, Pip," said Joe solemnly, with his last bite in his cheek and speaking in a confidential voice as if we two were quite alone, "you and me is always friends, and I'd be the last person to tell upon you any time, but such a—" He moved his chair and looked about on the floor between us, and then began again, "such a most common bolt as that."
"Been bolting his food, has he?"
cried my sister. You know, old chap," said Joe, looking at me and not at Mrs. Joe, with his bite still in his cheek, "I bolted myself when I was younger, frequent, and as a boy I've been among many bolters, but I've never seen a bolting equal to that yet, Pip, and it's a mercy you ain't bolted dead." My sister made a dive at me and fished me out by the hair, saying nothing more than the awful words,
"You come along and be dosed."
Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joe always kept a supply of tar water in the cupboard. having a belief in its virtues correspondent to its nastiness. At the best of times, so much of this elixir was administered to me as a choice restorative that I was conscious of going about smelling like a new fence. On this particular evening, the urgency of my case demanded a pint of this mixture, which was poured down my throat, and for my greater comfort, while Mrs. Joe held my head under her arm, as a boot would be held in a jackboot, Joe got off with half a pint, but was made to swallow that, much to his disturbance, as he sat slowly munching and meditating before the fire, because he had had a turn. Judging from myself, I should say he certainly did have a turn afterwards, if he'd had no turns before. Conscience is a dreadful thing when it accuses a man or boy, when, in the case of a boy, that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers. It is, as I can testify, a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his, united to the necessity of my always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat, or as when I was ordered about the kitchen on any small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. Then, as the marsh winds made the fire glow and flare, I thought of the voice outside, of the man with the iron on his leg, who had sworn me to secrecy, declaring that he couldn't and wouldn't starve until tomorrow, but must now be fed. Now! At other times I thought, what if the young man, who was with so much difficulty restrained from imbuing his hands into me, should yield to a constitutional impatience, or should mistake the time, and should think himself a creditor to my heart and liver tonight instead of tomorrow? If ever anyone's hair stood on my head with terror, mine must have done so. But perhaps nobody's ever did. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon my leg, and that made me think afresh of the man with the load on his leg, and found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out at my ankle quite unimaginably. Happily, I slipped away and deposited that part of my conscience in my garret bedroom. "Hark!" said I, when I had done my stirring and was taking a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. "What was that great guns, Joe?"
"Ah," said Joe, "there's another convict off."
"What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly,
"Escaped! Escaped!"
administering the definition like tar water. While Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework, I put my mouth out into forms of saying to Joe,
"What's a convict?"
Joe put his mouth into forms of returning with such highly elaborate answers that I could make out nothing of what he said but the single word,
"Pip." "There was a convict off last night," said Joe aloud, "after sunset gun, and they fired a warning of him, and now it appears they're firing a warning for another."
Who's firing?" said I.
"Drat the boy!"
interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work.
"What a questioner he is! Ask no questions, you'll be told no lies."
It wasn't very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her, even if I did ask questions, but she never was polite unless there was company. At this point, Joe greatly augmented my curiosity by taking the utmost pains to open his mouth very wide and to put it in the form of a word that looked to me like skulks. Therefore, I naturally pointed to Mrs. Joe and put my mouth into the form of saying, "Ha!" But Joe wouldn't hear of that at all, and again opened his mouth very wide in the form of a most emphatic word, but out of it I could make nothing. "Mrs. Joe," said I as a last resort, I should like to know, if you wouldn't mind much, where the firing comes from."
"Lord bless the boy!"
exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary.
"From the hulks."
"Oh," said I, looking at Joe. "Hulks." Joe gave me a reproachful cough, as much as to say,
"Well, I told you so."
And please, what's hulks?" said I.
"That's the way with this boy,"
exclaimed my sister, pointing at me with her needle and thread and shaking her head at me.
"Answer him one question, and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships, right across the marshes. We always use that name for the marshes."
I wonder who's put in prison ships and why they're put there," said I in a general way, with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe, who immediately rose.
"I'll tell you what, young fella," she said. "I didn't bring you up by hand to badger other people's lives out. It wouldn't blame me and not praise if I had. People are put in hulks because they murder, and because they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad things, and they always begin by asking questions. Now, you get along to bed."
I was never allowed a candle to light me to bed, and as I went upstairs in the dark, with my head tingling from Mrs. Joe's thimble having played the tambourine upon it to accompany her last words, I felt fearfully sensible of the great convenience that the hulks were ready for me. I was clearly on my way there. I had begun by asking questions, and I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. Since that time, which is far enough away, I have often thought that few people knew what secrecy there is in the young under terror. No matter how unreasonable that terror, so that it be terror. I was in mortal terror of the young man who wanted my heart and liver. I was in mortal terror of my interlocutor with the iron leg. I was in mortal terror of myself, from whom an awful promise had been extricated. I had no hope of deliverance through my all-powerful sister, who repulsed me at every turn. I am afraid to think of what I might have done on requirement in the secrecy of my terror. If I slept at all that night, it was only to imagine myself drifting down the river on a strong spring tide to the hulks, a ghostly pirate calling out to me through a speaking trumpet as I passed through the gibbet station, that I had better come ashore and be hanged there at once and not put it off. I was afraid to sleep, even if I'd been inclined, for I knew that with the first faint dawn of the morning I must rob the pantry. There was no doing it in the night, for there was no getting a light by easy friction then. To have one, I must strike one out of a flint and steel, and that would have made a noise like the very pirate himself rattling his chains. As soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with grey, I got up and went downstairs, every board along the way, every crack in every board calling out after me, "Stop thief!" and "Get up, Mrs. Joe, get up!" In the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual owing to the season, I was very much alarmed by a hare hanging by its nails, whom I rather thought I caught when my back was half turned, winking at me. I had no time for verification, no time for selection, no time for anything, for I had no time to spare. I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, about half a jar of mincemeat, which I tied up in my pocket handkerchief at my sister's last slice, some brandy from a stone bottle, which I decanted into a glass bottle I had secretly used for making that intoxicating fluid, Spanish licorice water, up in my room, diluting the stone bottle from a jug in the kitchen cupboard. a meat bone with very little on it, and a beautiful, round, compact pork pie. I was nearly going away without the pie when I was tempted to mount upon a shelf to look at what was put away so carefully in a covered earthenware dish in the corner, and I found that it was the pie, and I took it, in the hope that it was not intended for early use and would not be missed for some time. There was a door in the kitchen communicating with the forge. I unlocked and unbolted that door, and got a file from among Joe's tools. Then I put the fastenings as I found them, opened the door at which I had entered when I ran home last night, shut it, and ran for all my worth for the misty marshes.